Good afternoon. I'm Karen Donfried, the president of GMF, and I am delighted to welcome all of you to this next edition of Transatlantic Talks. Our subject today is Ukraine and how we, transatlantic partners, are crafting our strategy toward Ukraine and Russia. How do we assess the latest agreement reached last week in Minsk by Presidents Poroshenko, Putin, Hollande, and Chancellor Merkel? The front page of today's Financial Times states, Ukraine ceasefire hangs by thread. What is your assessment of that? And what are the differences among European countries and across the Atlantic in managing this conflict? To shed light on all of these issues, we are delighted to have as our guest today Reinhard Bütikofer, who is co-chair of the European Green Party and a member of the European Parliament for the German Greens. He is a member of the Committee on Industry, Research, and Energy, and a substitute member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. He sits on the delegation for relations with the United States, as well as the delegation for relations with China. From 2002 to 2008, Reinhard was the National Party chairman of the German Green Party. Prior to that, he was active in German politics at the federal and state levels. He is also a longtime and good friend of ours here at GMF, so a very warm welcome to you, Reinhard. GMF's transatlantic talks are on the record, taped, and live streamed. These transatlantic talks pair senior government officials from one side of the Atlantic with a journalist from the other side to discuss the most pressing transatlantic issues. We have the wonderful fortune today of having with us Jill Dougherty to moderate the conversation with Reinhard. Jill is currently a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center, and she is an expert on Russia and the former Soviet Union in her own right. In her 3-decade career with CNN, she served as a foreign affairs correspondent based here in Washington, D.C. We are very lucky to have her, and Jill, thanks to you for joining us. And with that, I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. I am very excited that I have a chance to, I was going to refer to him as Herr Bütikofer, but we decided I'm Reinhard. So Reinhard it is, and so we will delve right in. And I'll just explain how we do this. It will be roughly a half an hour of a conversation between us, and then we throw it open to the floor. We really want to get some good questions and good discussion going. And I know, as we were discussing a little bit upstairs before this, we're faced right now with the situation, especially with Ukraine, with immediate challenges to security in Europe, and of course the relationship between Europe and the United States, and then broader issues, immediate burning issues and the conflict, and then the broader issues of how the relationship should be structured, where we're going, et cetera. So with that in mind, perhaps I could ask a question that has a bit of immediacy, but then you can broaden it out as you want. And that would be, I think, to begin with this ceasefire, if that is the word for it, whatever it is. And we have an odd situation of a ceasefire taking hold in some places, and then the town of Debaltseve under siege, and now the Ukrainian forces pulling out. It raises, I guess if I wanted to phrase it in a broader way, Reinhard, it would be, is this ceasefire going to lead to any type of resolution, or are we in Europe at least faced with the prospect of a conflict that really could go out of control?
First of all, let me thank Karen and the GMF for making this possible. I really appreciate that a lot. And when we met just a few minutes ago upstairs to warm up to each other, that reminded me of a conversation I had with Karen about a year ago, a little less than a year ago. When we saw the Ukrainian crisis evolving, it wasn't at the time imaginable to me how this would go, and that it would go to what we see now as a very bitter reality. The question, though, was a very important question that still is on the table. How much cooperation, how much cohesion, how much unanimity will we be able to produce between the US and Europe? And if we judge what has happened over this roughly 1 year, I would want to start from a very positive note, underscoring that we have had agreement on several subsequent levels of economic sanctions, whereas a lot of skeptical observers would have assumed that Europe would never pick up enough common political will and courage to agree on such sanctions. It's happened. And I think it has happened because there has been a similar approach from this administration here in Washington and from the European leaders also, that in this crisis, there's only one game that could possibly lead to a Ukrainian win or a win for the community of values that we represent, which is the long game and the non-military game. And in order to make that viable at all, we had to agree on several levels of action. And we have not yet reached the breaking point. And it may be interesting to look at what's happening in Greece right now. The immediate utterances of the new government and the fact that the new prime minister visited the Russian embassy as his first action in office seemed to be leading in a very tricky situation. And still, the new Greek government agreed just a few days after that to prolonging the sanctions that stand right now. And even Mr. Orban in Hungary, who's just welcomed President Putin for a weird, I should say, visit in which Mr. Putin laid a wreath at the memorial of the Soviet soldiers who helped oppressing the Hungarian Revolution in '56, honoring the oppressors. Still, Orban has not left the European orbit. So, and I think the Chancellor, the German Chancellor, has played a very important role in that game, together with her foreign minister. Let me spend two sentences on that, because over here, I'm afraid many people would assume that a foreign minister is just a leading official. In the particular German context of a coalition government, Foreign Minister Steinmeier is more than just a leading official who works under the guidance of the Chancellor. He is a player in his own right. And I think it's been most fortunate that we have had this tandem leading German foreign policy, because they have agreed and they have made it possible that in Germany there has been a more united public mood towards the Russians. So this is my basically positive starting point. Now, still, we have not achieved any solution, and even if the ceasefire would hold, maybe after the conquest of Debaltseve, would hold. Presently, as we said, it's just, the word ceasefire is just halfway true, yeah? There's still some fire. But even if it would not lead to a resolution. It would at best lead to a frozen conflict. And as the Chancellor argued in Munich and at the Security Conference, we're in for the long haul, and we're gonna have to accept the fact that this is not gonna be won on short notice or short call.
But Reinhard, if it is a frozen conflict, isn't that a win for Vladimir Putin?
Sure. It's a win that comes with a price. And I'm not at all sure that this will be a win for him in the medium and long term and from a strategic point of view. He is not as isolated internationally as it would look from a European angle. If you look at what the Chinese or the Indians or some other BRICS countries have been saying about the conflict, I think it would be a worthy goal of Western diplomacy to engage more with these powers and to invite them to have a closer look at what's happening there and whether they really want to condone that to the degree that they have. But there is a cost to his economy, and there is beginning to be a cost in the Russian public too. I saw a poll just this week, I think, or late last week, that indicates that presently 19% of Russian citizens believe that Ukraine should be a part of Russia, whereas a couple of months ago, at some point during 2014, the number was above 50%. So there is beginning to be a shift. All the soldiers' mothers organizations that try to educate the Russian public about the cost in lives that this hybrid war is costing the Russian people too. Even though they're being oppressed, they're not allowed to state freely what they want to say. This is not resonating just positively. The conquest of Crimea went down well with the Russian public. And even the more liberal audience in Moscow and Leningrad were somehow overwhelmed by a feeling of national grandeur when finally Russia scored a big victory there in their analysis. But the continuing conflict in those two eastern oblasts of Ukraine is not necessarily a popular thing. So there's going to be a cost. And then Putin is going to have to evaluate also what future cost will be. And one of the major victims will be, I believe, there is not going to be a strong perspective of modernizing the Russian economy.
In fact, that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. How concerned is Germany over a potential Russian economic meltdown?
I think everybody should be concerned about that, but I don't see that particular German sensitivity that you would have expected in the past. And it's remarkable how the German business community has reacted to this conflict. And in a positive way. There's always been the so-called Ostausschuss der deutschen Wirtschaft, the Eastern Trade Committee of the German business community. They've been calling the shots as regards Russian policy in Germany more broadly. In the beginning of the conflict, they tried to stick to their bottom line of understanding, quote unquote, what Putin was doing. That's why we coined that phrase, Putin Versteher, the people who pretend to understand and in reality sort of try to create acceptance. They were being contradicted by the leadership of the German Federation of Industry that strongly came down favoring the strategy, the approach that the federal government under the leadership of Mrs. Merkel had been taking. And I see behind that a certain shift in the evaluation of what business entities in Germany expect from an economic relationship with Russia? Maybe this is putting it too starkly, but I would say until the end of the tenure of President Medvedev, a lot of people still expected what at the time was being called a modernizing partnership. Somehow the Western companies would help Russia modernizing its economy, and by doing business, of course, make a buck or a euro also. I think the trust in that perspective has waned. And a lot of people now assume that Russia under Putin is more happy to be a kind of a perennial petrol state with a Dutch disease and has given up on the modernization strategy. And because of that, there is not as much sort of to be expected from that economic relationship. And there's not that much Russian openness. And I'm not even sure whether the offers from the West to integrate the Eurasian theater that Putin is trying to create with the EU is really from the angle of the powers that be in Moscow, whether that's even a promising perspective, or whether they rather would go towards some closing off of the Russian world towards the world of globalization. And because of that, the German business sector has not played that extra role that many over here also have been afraid of. It's been in lockstep, mostly.
You know, you mentioned, obviously, the role that Angela Merkel is playing, and the foreign minister, and Germany in general. And there is a school of thought out there that basically they are outsourcing Ukraine and some of the issues surrounding Ukraine to Angela Merkel, who is the strongest leader right now, you'd have to say, in Europe. Is that fair? I mean, is it fair to say that the U.S. is perhaps irrelevant in this?
I think it would be utterly foolish to say such a thing. Anything but. It's obvious that Angela Merkel is playing a particular role. And she does that because she speaks Russian and Putin speaks German. She has some personal attitudes that allow her to be very inventive when it gets to finding new opportunities of trying to look at possible ways out of a dilemma. She's not the kind of person that would immediately jump to a yes or no, 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 and everything else is bad. No, she always sort of tries to kick the can down the alley a while. And in this particular circumstance, this is a huge advantage. And also, she, of course, represents the most important economic power in Europe at the moment, and so on. You all know everything, I don't have to tell you. But Germany does not have the punch to pull it off. And I think it would be, from a strategic point of view, it would be just a terrible miscalculation if in the US there would be a prevailing attitude or a prevailing perception that somehow the US should focus on Islamic terrorism as a immediate and short-term challenge, and China's rise as the long-term challenge, and somehow the declining power of Russia should be handed over to them Europeans to take care of that. I think that will not work, that would not work. We need European involvement in the Islamic issues. We need more of a European pivot. I know the word is not popular here anymore, but we need a European pivot towards Asia more than we have, but we also need a reminding and constant engagement of the United States in that particular European theater, and for several reasons. For instance, Article 5 of NATO gets the bulk of its credibility from the fact that the President of the United States is saying so in the Baltic countries. The Chancellor has said that also. And I think she's also taken steps to corroborate that. But that in itself would not be as impressive as having President Obama do that. Also, I think Europe has benefited over the last couple of decades from the fact that there has been a benign external hegemon to allow Europe to not settle the perennial dispute over which European power might be the hegemon, which has always led into different kinds of abysses. So I think we need American involvement. And for instance, in the dimensions that President Biden mentioned in Munich on energy policy, anti-corruption, the US could play a major role.
You know, in this question of what, again, you do about Ukraine, I was looking at a quote by Carl Bildt, who said, every carrot to Kiev is a stick to Moscow. In other words, the more economic help that the West gives to Kiev, the better. I mean, what is your opinion right now about what should be done? Is enough being done economically? Or are we back to that debate that has plagued Ukraine for many years, which is why give them money if they are not willing or capable of carrying out true economic reform?
Basically, I agree with Carl, but we're not giving enough support. We're not necessarily giving the right support, and we're not presenting the right conditions for giving the support. I was a bit disappointed in Munich when President Poroshenko almost completely avoided the topic of reforms. He talked a bit about corruption, but that was about it. That didn't make a strong impression on me or other people in the audience. We don't give enough support. For instance, there's this huge internal refugee issue within Ukraine. The European Union basically hasn't done anything about it. My party has advocated to allow visa-free travels for Ukrainians. That has never been popular in the wider public or with the government, but in between what we have and what we advocated, little else has popped up. And then if you look at the support that the IMF is offering, it's tied to a program that tends to implement a similar strategy of austerity for Ukraine that is being criticized from the United States government if the Europeans apply it in Greece. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'm not sure I know about the restrictions that the IMF has, but I'm not sure we're doing the right thing. And yes, we have to be prepared to help them, even though we know that a lot of the money is going to be squandered, because we can't wait till all the oligarchs are out of power or out of business. We have to help them now.
I want to ask one more question, which is kind of a broad one, and then go to some questions from the audience. But you know, there's so much, when you look at this really from afar, it raises a question of, after the Soviet Union, why Russia was not fully integrated into the security structure of Europe. Now, the Russians would blame it on the West, of course, and many in the West would blame it on Russia for not sufficiently wanting to become, or doing the things that it should do to become fully integrated. And so you have this, a country that some would describe as an outlier, at least in security issues right now, which feels very alienated from what's going on. How do you, without writing a dissertation, but how do you answer that? I mean, how did this not happen at the end of the Soviet Union? And is there any way to pull it back on track and actually have some type of a cooperative security relationship with Moscow?
I recall having a discussion with my good friend Dan Hamilton in the early 90s about the ideas that were being peddled in the State Department at the time of including Russia maybe as a future NATO member. At the time, yes. I was very skeptical towards that, and we've moved a long way since then. In the beginning, not only President Yeltsin, but also his successor, President Putin, did not advocate the same kind of positions that he's taking today. And if the Russians now tell the narrative that they've always felt encircled and they've always been opposed to NATO expansion and EU expansion and all that, it's just not the truth. In 2004, at a common press conference with a Spanish prime minister, President Putin is on the record as saying publicly that Russia would not oppose Ukraine becoming a member of EU. So, and Russia, and again it was President Putin at the time who welcomed the inclusion of the Baltic countries in NATO. He's on the record of having said that. So Russia wasn't initially taking the same kind of attitude that President Putin is taking today. So something has changed there and not in the West's behavior. The West has helped creating a new security architecture. We haven't stood still. We have included all the countries that wanted to be included somehow in the Euro-Atlantic security architecture. And I think at least for a little while we should remind ourselves that there is this principle of self-determination, and it's not for the Americans and the Germans and the Russians to decide whether Poland, if they so wish, should become a member of NATO. Now, there also have been, and this needs being restated, differences within the Western alliance about how far we would go. I do recall the conversations in 2008 around the wish of the Bush administration to grant membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia. At the time, Germany opposed that successfully from their angle, and whatever the evaluation will be in the future, there hasn't been a unitary sort of policy from the West, always ignoring every single argument from the Russian side. My analysis would end with what I started saying about the turnabout of the economic perspective of Russia. Russia is turning inwards. And Russia is sort of trying to shut out the world, the globalizing world that it sees as a menace. And it's more the change within Russia that Putin impersonates that has brought about this strong coalition course than a particular strategy pursued by the West.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to go to some questions. Now, we have microphones in the back. At least we have two, I think, two. So let's open up the floor, and please, if you would identify yourself just briefly and then ask your question. Thank you.
Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. Thank you very much, Mr. Bütikofer. Appreciate your comments. I'd like to ask you maybe to focus a little more now on the situation inside Ukraine. We all know that if Minsk II has a chance to work, a lot will depend on how the two parties, if you want to, inside Ukraine will get along or not. And actually, I can quote Putin, who said, the Ukrainian crisis will not be over until the two sides inside Ukraine will come to a consensus. Let's take him seriously. How can we manage to make this inner Ukrainian peace process work? We have the contact group, of course. Do you think this would be the perfect instrument to make sure that the peace process in Ukraine is going to work, that they come to a point where the country can, settle down, focus on the economic issues, and get back to work again? Do you see a way of us helping to make that process work? Again, the contact group will be the decisive force, and it's a weak instrument. We have to realize that. The pro-Russian side inside the contact group is pretty strong. I mean, look at who's sitting there. The two republics, Luhansk and Donetsk, and the Russian ambassador to Kiev, Leonid Kuchma, and the one European force is the OSCE, and Mrs. Televini, right?
Okay.
Is this the best way to make things work inside Ukraine? And there's a lot of work to do. Thank you.
I'm afraid I would not agree with your analysis that the contact group is the most important format. I would think that the Normandy format is more important than that. And I also do not agree with the description of the conflict as an inner Ukrainian conflict. There obviously is an inner Ukrainian dimension to the conflict, but neither when it originated nor as it evolved has this been mainly driven by inner Ukrainian contradictions. It's not a secret anymore that the guys who first rose up in arms in the Donbas were Russian agents who acted because the political mobilization of pro-Russian separatists who wanted to sort of get away from the Kiev control, who had no trust in Kiev, had failed politically. They organized major demonstrations. There was some political conflict, but it did not spill over into military action. It was people, Strelkov was one of them, a Russian officer who was one of the commanding guys who started that, and he has boasted publicly of being the first to raise up in arms. So, and the conflict would have terminated by now if the Russian side had not supplied and continued to supply the so-called separatists with heavy armament that makes them now militarily superior to the official Ukrainian army. So I think the sticking point is, will we be able to convince the one decisive person in the new Tsarist Russia, President Putin, that it is in the better interest of Russia to stop feeding the fire, or will he believe that he will gain more from continuing to do what he does? And once he makes up his mind, and I think that it is important that the West and the Ukrainians stay together to give him one united message. Once he makes up his mind, there will be no problem with ruling in and reigning in the insurrectionist forces.
Do we have more questions? Yes, sir. Can you get a microphone over there?
Gegam Galublishvili, former Georgian ambassador to NATO. Well, I wholly agree that it's not a Ukrainian crisis, it's actually a Russian crisis, revisionist Russian crisis. And there are a short comment and then a subsequent question. So There are two dimensions from my perspective. The first is what Russians are trying to achieve right now, and what is the main threat from the Russian perspective is to have a successful Ukraine. Because having successful Georgia, having successful Ukraine will eventually trigger some undesired events in Moscow and will force the current administration to be changed. But there is another dimension as well: how we are going to raise the costs for invading their neighbors. So sanctions may or may not work, may or may not be coherent, but without supplementing sanctions by providing Ukraine defense capabilities, do you think that we really can raise the cost for Putin to eventually convince them that there is a high risk of invading its neighbors? Because again, I don't think that Putin is going to stop in Ukraine, because he hasn't stopped in Georgia. And Ukraine is not his last destination. He has mentioned many times what is his final goal, and it's probably NATO, to turn NATO into a paper tiger. So again, how we can raise the cost for invading European nations by the Russian side? Thank you.
Let me try to make a few distinctions. I'm not sure that it's the primary aim of the Russian leadership to prevent a successful Ukraine. I'm convinced that it's a primary goal for them to prevent NATO or EU membership of Ukraine. If you take, by comparison, the Georgian case, they have created two frozen conflicts on the territory of Georgia, but they have not prevented Georgia from being much more successful, reformed, and advanced than Ukraine has ever been since they got out from the Soviet Union. So somehow Russia was able to countenance a relatively successful Georgian development with a democracy that even allows a change of guard in the parliament and the presidency and all that. But and I'm not sure that they would be dead set to prevent that in the Ukrainian case. But they want to pursue a policy, I'm convinced, that does not allow the Ukrainian people the sovereignty over choosing its own alliances. That's, I think, what is a basic premise of the Russian policy. Second, you spoke about the threat of Russia endangering neighbors. You used a very general term. I would insist on making a major distinction there between neighbors that are under the protection of Article 5 of NATO and neighbors that are not. This president and the German chancellor and everybody, the new NATO Secretary General and everybody of any stature has said Article 5 is gonna be implemented, and this is an ironclad truth. And I strongly believe in that. And the Germans, who are never very eager to sort of get involved militarily, have put troops into some of the Baltic countries, helping these countries that have very weak military protection of their own to defend their security. And the Germans are now even co-leading an effort within NATO to create a rapid reaction force that could really be called rapid, because it would react within 48 hours, and they're taking the lead in that. That's not something you would have expected. So I think there is a clear message. Article 5 stands. And I don't think that we should allow those voices to get out of control that sort of mix up the Baltic case or the Romanian case or any other that are a member of NATO or the EU, with the Ukrainian case, as bitter as it is for the Ukrainians that they are in a different situation.
More questions?
And, sorry, I forgot third part of your question about lethal aid. I don't believe that. I don't think it would change the dynamic in our favor or in the Ukrainian favor. The military game is Putin's game. The only game he could possibly win would be the military game, because he's closer, he's more daring, he knows what is at stake. You saw that when the Ukrainian army during the middle of last year made some advances, reconquered Slavyansk and other cities. He immediately threw in as much military capabilities as he deemed necessary to reverse that course of events. And then again in August, same thing. So he is always going to be risking more than the West is going to risk. And I'm afraid that if we let him draw us into that game, we're game. And I would rather want to pursue the course that the Chancellor argued very strongly in Munich, which is the strategic patience game. That is not just a soft power game. The economic action that we're taking is not just soft. That wouldn't be adequate. We are really taking heavy action, and if the Russians persist in what they have been doing and sort of progress further, there must be additional sanctions. But this is a different game, and I don't think we should. And if you ask the people who advocate that over here, what if, what after? Senators Graham and McCain don't have an answer. They just have this impulse. Whenever there's a problem, send American arms. That's not adequate.
Okay. You know, I think we have to go on to other questions, sorry. Yes, sir, right there. We have a couple of questions back there.
Kyle Scott, the State Department fellow here at the German Marshall Fund. You mentioned, and you just talked about it again, strategic patience, the long game. All of this implies that we have a strategy. I'm not clear that Europe or the United States really has a strategy right now for dealing with Russia. Could you help me out and define what you understand that strategy to be?
I just read Fiona Hill's article yesterday from Brookings, and she tried to propose a strategy. I would basically go along with that.
And can you describe that?
Well, it starts with realism, and then it sort of includes different elements. And the most pertinent part of her analysis, in my mind, was that the US has to continue engaging in the Russian and European issues. So she argues forcefully, and I'm completely in unison with that, that the US should sort of find its own ways of help herding the cattle that's in danger of getting lost, help working on what we call the European neighborhood countries, and not sort of hand it over to the Europeans to take care of that while the US is tending to more urgent business. I already alluded to how I see that. Let's get involved in all the pertinent conflicts with different roles, of course, but together. And that is, I believe, the most important strategic answer. If there would be an attitude, and I'm not saying there is, but some people think there might be. So I'm cautious here. But if there would be an attitude of saying, let the Europeans take care of that, and if they really fumble the ball, then maybe we will have to look after that. That would certainly not be a strategy, and I don't think we should go there.
But Reinhard, if I could jump in, because just to put a little point on that question, how do you deny Putin the opportunity for aggressive action at the same time that you want to have some type of cooperation on security issues that are very important? How do you do that?
The late Israeli Prime Minister Rabin once said, commenting on Israeli-Palestinian relations, fight terrorism as if there was no peace process, and pursue the peace process as if there was no terrorism. You can't find an answer without going to that kind of dialectic. And I think some of the action that we're taking together, like negotiating with Iran, is not because the Russians want to do us a favor. It's because they would be as concerned, maybe not quite as concerned as we are, but they would also be concerned about Iran acquiring a nuclear breakout capability. So they are negotiating there also on the basis of their own interest. And the Russians have an experience with very radical, very powerful, very cynical Islamic terrorism in their own country. So they may take a very objectionable position on Syria, but they're not completely ignorant of the broader issue. And I believe that from a realpolitik point of view, you can cooperate with them on such issues, and we're still cooperating with them on, let's say, the way out of Afghanistan. They're helping us to settle that account. So I don't see a contradiction between sort of pushing back and cooperating on other scores.
This is a gentleman right there in the middle.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Miro Popadze from Embassy of Georgia. It is obvious that Putin's main strategy is to recreate the Soviet Union. In 2008, Putin invaded Georgia. Georgia was not held by the West at all. And now we see that Putin is following the same strategy. It continues its aggression in Ukraine. Okay? Let's say if this Minsk agreement does not work, what's the plan B in the West? Obviously, Germany opposes to provide Ukraine with lethal weapons, and the United States government is considering it. So what's the plan B for the West to stop Putin's aggression in Ukraine? Thank you.
I'm not capable of coming up with a theoretical plan B. I think we have to play it by the ear. We can sort of describe the general conceptual framework, but what we do under those assumptions has to depend on the development on the ground, and also the development within the public conversation over here, or the public conversation in some of the European member states about the cohesion of the EU, and so on and so on. And I don't believe there is a simple alternative. Play the economic and diplomatic game, or sort of turn around and invest in a military buildup in Ukraine. I don't think anybody should believe that there could possibly be a military solution in Ukraine's or our favor. If there would be a military solution, it would only be in Putin's favor. So let's not invest too much in a game we can't possibly win on that level. Let's invest in a game that we might be able to win. And sorry to say, there is no historical guarantee that this would be won. Ukraine is presently not able to mobilize the powers of its citizens to the best possible, most efficient level because of internal corruption and because of lack of economic strength and all that. So I think there's a lot between conceding defeat and where we are now that we still can do. And I again come back to Carl Bildt's quote. Let's help the transformation of Ukraine. That could be a very powerful game.
There's a question over here, Nicole, I think in the back.
Thank you for doing this. Nicole Gowett with Bloomberg News. You said that there is that the military game is Putin's game. I think we could argue that there's another sort of game going on, and that one involves information, the creation of narratives, competing narratives that are targeted to domestic Russian consumption, but also the very sizable Russian-speaking minorities in the border states. And I was wondering if you could give us the European perspective on how this can be countered and if it can be countered. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think there's even a third dimension to that, which is addressing the public in our own countries. So there is a very proactive Russian news offensive in Germany, for instance, and in other European countries. And they deliberately spread false news and blatant lies and try to undermine the cohesion of the public opposition to Russian policies. There is an institution called the European Endowment for Democracy, which is presently looking into opportunities of how to counter that. They have been mandated by the Swedish government and the Polish government and a few others to do a study, to facilitate a study in what the different options would be for public broadcasters, governments, all kinds of different actors to come up with counter measures. This is running up till middle of the year, and it would then be evaluated. There has been an incipient conversation in the public as regards this dimension of hybrid warfare, and I think we have to look at protecting public infrastructure, not only in the physical sense of protecting, let's say, the energy transmission infrastructure, but also protecting public infrastructure as regards infrastructure that allows public policy communication. Of course, we want to do that in our particular Western way, and I don't think it would be at all credible or successful if we just try to do the inverse of what the Russians do, come up with our own propaganda lies. That wouldn't fly. So we have to use the power of freedom to counter that, but we have to do that in an organized way. And I'm not sure we are well enough organized to really pursue a policy that says, look, there's been a lie, we won't let it fly. We will sort of come up with a put down. We come up with an answer to that. We really fight back. We don't ignore it. Maybe we have pursued a media policy that is built on the premises of media freedom, and we have to continue doing that. But then we may have been a bit lenient with allowing some propaganda to just stand unchallenged, and we should be more consequential there.
I think there was one more question over here, and then we'll go to you.
Follow-up question. First of all, my name is Yela De Franceschi, and I work for Voice of America.
I'm sorry, could you say?
My name is Yela De Franceschi, and I work for Voice of America, and we're doing exactly what you are now describing. But I'd like to ask a follow-up question to several that you got from this side of the section. Is there a tipping point for Germany and for Europe after which this strategic patience theory sort of expires? Because there's no guarantee that Putin will stop even after achieving what he wants in Ukraine. I mean, no one can say that he won't go further or test Europe and Article 5 as well in his sort of, follow-up actions.
I can't define a tipping point, and I would think it would be not very smart if anybody did, because on one hand it would signal, oh, that's how far you can go. This is what we will concede anyhow. I think we shouldn't do that. And then I think it merits sort of pushing back every single step. Some people have argued that from a military point of view, it would be very attractive for the Russian side to not only conquer the rest of the two oblasts, Luhansk and Donetsk, including Mariupol on the seashore, but also to create a land bridge to Crimea. And then somebody said, well, what do you think why they haven't done that yet? And I'm not able to give an answer, but maybe it's because of the kind of pushback that they have encountered that they haven't done that yet. If there wouldn't have been any action from our side, they might have done that yet. Because from their logic, it would be an easier task to supply Crimea if they had that. So let's not look for the one tipping point. Let's fight back or push back continuously at every single step. And I think that has to be the persistent approach.
There's a gentleman right there.
Thank you. Jean-François Boitin, two questions really. First one is about European energy policy, both essential from an internal EU perspective, but also as a tool against Russia. And do the recent declarations of Mr. Orban endanger that? How do you see that proceeding in the next months? And the second question is, isn't it the perfect moment for European governments to actually increase their military budget and develop a better military cooperation?
Let me take your first question first. I like that better. I think you've seen, or you can observe a major shift as regards European energy policy. In 2006, when the Russians closed the valve for the first time, Europe basically turned the other cheek and hoped it would go away and never reoccur again. Then in 2009, when they did it again, we started acting and increasing the resilience by creating reverse flow technical abilities and by coming up with common legislation under the Polish concept of energy solidarity. And we're now in a much more resilient state. Still, some member countries are vastly dependent on just one source of energy, like Bulgaria, and it's very easy to blackmail such countries. Hungary is another case. I have long felt that the theory of mutual dependency between us in the West and the Russians in the field of energy was somehow not right. I recall co-signing a letter to the members of state and government of NATO and EU member states in 2008 with a couple of people from over here, from the Congress, and some very few European leaders, like Carl Bildt at the time, to say the Russians are trying to use energy as a political weapon, and we should take note of that. At the time, I got in terrible trouble with my chancellor because he thought that was unbecoming for a member of the German coalition to say such a thing. Now we are beginning to, I know I'm extrapolating, but we're beginning to change our philosophy. The philosophy is not going to be mutual dependency because more and more actors have understood that from the Russian angle, this is not a business proposition. This is an imperial issue. So they function under different logic. And for instance, with regard to the southeastern European countries, the Commission is now advocating that every single country should have 3 sources of fossil energy supply. That's a major shift. Or look at South Stream. In the beginning, everybody knew that South Stream was not in conformity with the European energy legislation, and still nobody did much about it. And I recall talking to people in the Energy Commissioner's office and them telling me, look, we can't condone that Gazprom doesn't even ask. But if they ask, they will get all the exceptions they want to have. That changed after the outbreak of the Ukrainian crisis, and it forced the Russians to sort of give up on South Stream. There is a clear shift, and the concept of energy union, which is not that much of a new concept. It's been peddled 10 years ago. I think it was indeed the Greens who invented that concept, but now it's become a mainstream concept, and it's one of the core projects of this Commission. And there will be, it may be too audacious to say turning our back on Russia, because that's not going to happen overnight, but we will reduce our dependency on Russian energy supply step by step. That's a decisive shift, and you've seen the Chancellor expressing that in other terms, and I think that is going to have a long-term effect also on the perspectives of the Russian petrol state.
Now, your less favorite question about the spending on security, I think that was what it was. And if you could kind of keep it brief, I'd love to get, we have what, 5 minutes or so? There's one other question that I'd like to get, so if you can, Reinhard.
That serves me well.
Not too
My
much.
basic answer is, let's cut wasteful spending first. NATO has advocated a smart spending strategy for years without making much progress. The EU has advocated a pooling and sharing strategy without making a lot of progress. I think it's utterly inconceivable that all the European EU member states would live up to the faint promise of 2% of GDP. Even the Brits are falling below that level right now. But you could get a lot more bang out of the euro if you didn't multiply the capabilities and allow wasteful spending, because everybody has to have their own capabilities. So pooling and sharing would be the smartest approach, and we could go a long distance if we allowed the EDA, the European Defense Agency, and other concerned institutions to really lead the way in that direction.
Okay, and there was one question, gentleman right there.
Will Marshall, Progressive Policy Institute. Reinhard, thank you for these wonderful insights. If Minsk II goes the way of Minsk I, pressure in the United States for arming Ukraine will certainly rise, and it won't just be Lindsey Graham and John McCain. There's already a lot of support on the Democratic side. And I think it's safe to say there'd be more. The president seems to be seriously keeping that option on the table and thinking about it. If the United States were to decide that the only way to give teeth to Western diplomacy here were to cross that threshold and offer arms, would this be a fatal blow to Western unity, to transatlantic unity, or would the Chancellor and France find a way to accommodate this shift and use it? That is, to what extent is ruling out military weapons, a fundamental principle of European diplomacy in this instance?
Well, I strongly believe that the strategic imperatives don't change. So if the US, just hypothetically, would adopt such a policy, there would still be a necessity to work towards as much cohesion as we can possibly achieve. It would be more difficult. And I would expect that in Europe you would have kind of the old division possibly between what Secretary Rumsfeld used to call old Europe and new Europe. It already started sort of resonating a little bit over the last couple of months. I would regret that, obviously, and certainly Germany would not join the bandwagon. The Chancellor has excluded that definitively, and if she had not, she would be forced by public opinion in Germany to do so tomorrow morning. So clearly that's not a route that we will travel, and I expect quite a few other European countries to be on our side of this divide. But what would come of that would depend on, I believe, whether we, in spite of such a tactical conflict, could still help ourselves in coming up with a united analysis and a united definition of a strategic goal. It would be more difficult, I believe, than it has been, but it would still be the thing to go for.
And that's going to be our last question and answer. So thank you very much, Reinhard Bütikofer. It was very stimulating and extremely helpful in trying to wend our way through all of these issues, short-term and long-term. So thank you very much.